Hey everybody, in this video I'm going to show you how you can safely replace a broken garage door spring and save a ton of money. Let's get started. Now before I even get started, first a word on safety. This project is one that can be a little bit dangerous. You see, these springs store a ton of potential energy, and the last thing I want to do is have somebody get hurt. So only follow these instructions and attempt this project if you're pretty handy in the first place and if you're capable of really carefully following instructions. Also, you're going to definitely want to have some safety gear. Okay, I'm ready, boss. Whoa. Go away. That's too much. But you do want some safety glasses for sure, and probably a pair of gloves. Next, let's talk about the tools and supplies you're going to need to complete this job. First, you're going to need a measuring tape or ruler that we'll use to help determine exactly what size replacement spring you'll need. A regular file, something like this, that we'll use to remove burrs on our torsion tube. And then for working on the set screws and the mounting bolts, you'll need a 7/16 and a 9/16 12-point socket. If you don't have those, then you can use a 9/16 and a 3/8 box end wrench. You'll definitely need at least one pair of vice grips, though the process I'm going to show you will recommend using two. You'll also need a set of winding rods like these, and I recommend that you don't skimp on these. Go ahead and get yourself an actual set of winding rods. You definitely don't want to try and use some other piece of metal you have on hand. It's not safe. These are engineered specifically to hold the torque that you're going to be putting onto the spring, and they're really not very expensive. I'll leave a link down in the description below. A little bit of lubricant will really help this job to run smoothly. And finally, of course, the replacement spring itself. And as I mentioned at the beginning, safety is my top priority here, so I will be wearing some safety glasses and gloves. And finally, you're going to need a ladder. Now, I don't recommend just using a small step stool. This door we're going to be working on today is only a 7-foot tall door, so I can actually reach a lot of this stuff without having to get up on anything really tall. But when you're winding that spring, you're going to need the leverage that a full ladder will provide to you. Don't skimp on this step. Use a full-size ladder. Here's a quick handy tip for the winding bars. Put a little bit of electrical tape, about 3/4 or so of an inch from the end. That way, you'll be able to tell exactly when it has seated all the way in the winding cone. You don't want to accidentally seat these only a little bit and have one slip. That can be disastrous. One last piece of housekeeping to mention before we climb up on the ladder and get started with the repair process, and that is the spring I'm going to be using today was provided by doorparts.com. I've been working with them for a little while now on some of my other videos for garage door replacement things, and they have been excellent to work with. I've heard from viewers who have loved getting their parts there. If you're looking for parts or springs to replace any of the stuff on your garage door, I highly recommend you reach out to them. They also offer this excellent lubricant that we'll be using today as well. Now, before you can even start this project, of course, you have to get a replacement spring. Ordering a replacement spring is really pretty easy, but there are 3 things you have to know. First, you need to know the whole overall length of your existing spring. You need to know how thick is the wire that the spring is wound out of, and how wide is the diameter of your spring. Let me show you how you can get all 3 of those measurements. To measure the length, since the spring's already broken, you'll likely have a big gap here. What you need to do then is measure each of the 2 sections and add those measurements together. Now note, I'm not going to be measuring all the way to the end of the whole thing where the cone is. I'm only measuring the springs themselves. So this is 27 inches on this section. And then if I measure this other section, again, I'm not measuring all the way to the mounting bracket. I'm only measuring the coils of spring themselves. That's 2 inches. So 27 inches here and another 2 inches there. It's a 29-inch spring. Measuring the diameter of the wire that was used for your coil can be a little difficult, but here's a neat trick. You can see I've made a mark right here and right here. Those marks are 20 coils apart from each other. Now if I take a measuring tape and I measure the distance from one mark to the other, I get about 4 3/8 inches or so, which if you then divide by 20 will give you the diameter of the wire, which is 0.21875 inches. So that's the original size of this spring. So now we know that this spring originally was 29 inches long and used a wire size of 0.21875. Now we just need to know the diameter. Now you can try and get a measurement like this with a tape measure and you might get pretty close. You can of course measure this more accurately once the spring is removed, but there's also usually a measurement that is printed on the winding cone, and in this case we can see it is measured at 175 or 1.75 inches. Now often when you're shopping online, you might find that they don't offer a 1.75 spring. Most places online only carry 2-inch springs. But don't worry, it's easy to do the conversion. In fact, when I called up doorparts.com, they just did the conversion for me. So we're going to be replacing a 1.75 inch spring with a 2 inch spring that's a little bit shorter. It's still sized perfectly for this door, and they did all of the work to convert it for me. So knowing the length, the diameter, and the wire size is all you need, and then you'll be able to get a good replacement spring. There's one more thing that's very easy to get confused about, and that's the difference between the left hand and the right hand spring. Here's what I mean by that. When you're standing in the garage looking out like this, there's going to be one spring that you can install on the left-hand side of the center bracket up at the top, and another spring you can install on the right-hand side of the center bracket. As I've mentioned, some doors only have one spring, but your spring will be installed on either the left or the right-hand side. Here's where it gets confusing though. The spring that's installed on the left-hand side of the door over here is a right wound spring, and the spring that's installed over on the right-hand side of the door is a left wound spring. So the winding direction is opposite the side that the spring gets installed on. And they're sold that way because you always want to be pushing up to tension the spring. Make sure you're paying very close attention when you're ordering or verifying the springs that you've received. You need to make sure that if you've got a spring you're installing on the right-hand side of the door, it's a left wound spring. And if you're installing it on the left side of the door, it's a right wound spring. Okay, let's get into the actual procedure of how we replace this spring. The very first step is to unplug your existing garage door opener. The last thing you want is for someone to come out and press the button while you have this thing disassembled. Next, we'll disengage the trolley just by pulling on the release spring like that. And it's a good idea to just completely remove the trolley arm, and we can do that by pulling out the pin that's right here at the top. That'll just give us a little bit better access for working on the spring. With the door unplugged and the trolley disconnected, next we need to make sure the tension has been removed from the springs. Now you'll notice today I'm working on a door that only has one spring, and that spring has broken, so of course the tension has been removed there. If your door has two springs though, you need to detension the other spring. Everything I'm showing you today on a single spring door will apply even if you're working on a door that has two springs. You're just going to need to do everything I show you on the one spring on both sides. You can't do any of the next steps until you have made sure that there is no tension on any spring on your door. Before I show you how to remove the tension from a spring like this, first a quick word about safety. These springs store a ton of potential energy in them, and you need to be aware that the area from about here to about here is what I call the danger zone. You do not want to put your body, and especially your head, in the danger zone like this. It can be very tempting while you've got these winding bars up here in the cone to try and put your head in line with it so you can see a little bit better what you're doing. The danger with that though is if your hand slips off of that winding bar, there's a lot of pressure on them, it's going to come down really fast and possibly hit you in the head or in the face. Also, anytime you're winding or unwinding a spring, there's a little bit higher likelihood that that spring will break. And if that happens, the tension release on this cone is going to cause it to spin around very quickly, and you really don't want anything in the path of where a flying bar might be or an unwinding spring might be. So when you are winding or unwinding these springs, position your body and especially your head off to one side so you are out of the danger zone. With all that in mind, here's how you remove the tension from a spring like this. Take your first winding bar and put it into one of the available holes in the cone that's facing out towards the center of the garage. Then you're going to lift up on that, and while you do that, that should give you just enough clearance to put your other winding bar into the hole facing down towards the ground. Once that's in, it will lock against the top of the garage door, and you can remove your top winding bar. Now you'll notice I'm holding on to this winding bar with my hand, and I'm keeping a firm grip on it through this whole process because you don't want this thing to go shooting across the garage, as I've already mentioned. Next, we'll take our 3/8 box end wrench and we'll use that to loosen the set screws. And you don't need to take these all the way out. Just give them a couple of quarter turns. That should loosen them enough that you can then use just finger pressure to spin them out a little bit to make sure that they are not touching the torsion tube anymore. Now we're going to put our winding bar into the top hole, rotate the spring up a little bit so we can remove our lower winding bar and let the spring down. Then we just repeat this pattern over and over again until we removed all of the tension from the spring. With each turn, the tension decreases as the spring unwinds until you can finally finish the last part by hand. Next, we need to release the cable from the winding drum. If you come up, this should turn freely. You'll be able to just turn it so that this cable gets a little bit of slack in it, and then you can reach up over the top and release the cable from the drum. Then you can pull it down and put it through this hole here, where it can stay until we're ready to reattach things. Next, there are 2 set screws in the winding drum that you need to loosen, and these should have a square 3/8 inch head. And you don't need to take these all the way out, just loosen them. And when you do that, get them to the point that they are nice and loose enough you can easily turn them with your fingers. The drum should slide, and we're going to just slide it in about a foot or so from that end. Repeat the same process on the winding drum on the other side of the door. Remove the cable, put it through the little triangle that's at the top of the door, and then loosen the set screws and pull the drum in a little bit. Now we can remove our center bracket using a 9/16 socket and box end wrench. As with the set screws, as soon as these are broken loose, you should be able to remove them by hand. If there's a warning label attached to one of the bolts, leave that warning label intact and reinstall it the same way when you install the new spring. With the mounting bolts removed, inspect the bearing that rides inside the spring end. This one's in good condition, but could use a little bit of lubrication, which we'll take care of at a later step. Loosen the screws that are in the winding cone, again using the 3/8 box end wrench. Then slide the spring towards the outside edge of the garage door. Next, we're going to slide the torsion bar until we get about a 6-inch or so gap, and then you can slide off the turning drum, place that off to the side. And then you can slide off the spring. And the other broken piece. And now we're ready to slide the spring on. It can help to pull the torsion bar towards you a little bit out of its bracket. And then also, lining up the torsion bar with the hole in the end of the spring can be a little tricky. I find putting a finger in there and helping to guide it really helps. Just be careful you don't pinch your finger. With the spring on, we can put this back on there. And then we can slide the spring all the way back. Seat the bearing into the end of the spring, then slide the spring all the way to the mounting bracket. Insert the mounting bolts and start the nuts by hand. Once you get them close to seated, make sure you line them up with the witness marks that were left from when the spring was previously installed. This will help make sure everything stays lined up correctly. Then tighten the bolts and nuts all the way with the 9/16 socket and box end wrench. On the left-hand side of the door, now it's time to line up your torsion tube with the witness marks that were left from the previous installation. This helps make sure the torsion tube stays centered over the door. We're about ready to put the drums back on, but before I do, I like to take a file, find where the set screws were previously locked into that torsion tube, and just file them down a little bit, just in case there's any burrs that might make it difficult to get the drum back in position. Once those have been filed down smooth, where there's no burrs you can feel with your finger anymore, you can now take your drum and slide it back. Now, it's really important to make sure that the drum slides all the way until it stops. Don't put it a little bit close, it's got to be all the way against that end. That'll make sure that the cable that will wind up around the drum is going to be lined up properly with the gap down below. Next, we're going to take our cable and we'll bring it behind this tube here. Don't put it across the front, that's the wrong side. Bring it behind the tube and over the top of the drum and slot it in to the lock slot at the side of the drum that's on the outside, and then feed the cable into that first slot. Now, if you're accidentally pull the drum a little bit towards you while you do that, just make sure before you lock down those set screws that you put the drum all the way back against that bracket. Make sure it's nice and tight like that. And the last thing to mention at this step before we lock down these set screws here is to make sure that you've taken up any tension on this cable just by twisting the drum as tight as you can. Make sure that the cable is locked into its slot and that it starts in that first little slot that the cable is sort of guided into the drum on, and then just twist the drum by hand until it's snug enough to take up the tension on that cable. Then we can lock down these set screws. I start them by hand. Once you feel them hit, they only take about 3/4 more of a turn. So there's a 1/4 turn, there's a 1/2, and there's 3/4. Don't do any more than that, you'll just bend the torsion tube. Make sure you tighten up both set screws in the same manner. Once the set screws are tight, now I'm going to just twist the rod as tightly as I can with one hand and then put a pair of vice grips on with the other. And I'm going to put the back handle of the vice grips against the header above the door, and then we'll lock the vice grips closed. And that's going to hold this torsion bar so it can't spin and it maintains some tension on the cable. With things set up this way on this side, we're ready to go do the drum on the other side. Repeat this process on the drum on the right hand side of the door. Feed in the cable and lock it into the starting groove. Make sure the drum is pushed all the way to the outer bracket and then take up any slack that is in the cable by hand and lock down the set screws. Now we're almost ready to wind the springs. Before we start winding the springs, we want to make sure that there's no chance the door can open as we're winding. So I'm going to put a pair of vice grips on the track just above one of the wheels. That way if the door tries to open, it'll hit the vice grips and stop it from moving. Now we're finally ready to start tensioning this spring, but before I do, a quick reminder about this danger zone. Position your body off to the side so that in case anything happens, the spring breaks or suddenly the tension is released, you are out of the way and you stay safe. And a final caveat, this video is for informational purposes only, and while I hope you find it to be a very useful guide for helping you to replace a garage door spring like this, ultimately your safety is your own responsibility. So be very careful and please don't get hurt. So how do you wind this thing? Well, winding is done in 1/4 turn increments, and commonly when you refer to how many turns you put into the door, you're actually referring to the number of 1/4 turns you're putting into the door. And on a 7-foot door like I'm working on today, you'll want to put in between 28 and 30 1/4 turns, or on an 8-foot door, you'll put in between 32 and 34 1/4 turns. This works out to about a full rotation of the spring for every foot of door height, or about a 1/4 turn for every 3 inches of door height. So if your door is taller or shorter than what I've talked about, you can adjust accordingly. Just put in a 1/4 turn of the spring for every 3 inches of door height. To tension this spring, first I check to make sure that my set screws are loose and that they are not touching the torsion bar, and they are not, and that the winding cone can turn freely on the torsion bar, and it does, so we're ready to start winding here. I'm going to take my hand and just turn the spring a little bit so that it puts a little bit of tension on there, just barely enough to be able to hold my first winding bar. If I let go, it almost but not quite falls out. This is what I call turn 0, so we haven't put any turns or 1/4 turns into this spring yet. Now I'm going to be putting in my turns, and I'm putting them in a 1/4 turn at a time, as I've mentioned, and this is a 7-foot tall door, so it needs between 28 and 30 1/4 turns. So I'm going to rotate the spring a 1/4 of a turn. Then while I'm holding that up with one hand, I'll put in my second bar in the next hole and I'll rotate again. That's 2 1/4 turns. Repeat this process, that's 3 1/4 turns, until you have all the turns put into the spring that you need. That's 4. Count carefully as you add turns and take a break if your arms get tired. Remember to keep a firm grip on the turning rods during this whole process. I mentioned this before, but make sure when you seat these turning rods that you don't put them in only halfway. Make sure they seat all the way in, so there's no chance of it slipping, coming loose, or hurting anybody. All right, I've got my initial 28 turns into this spring, so I'm about ready to tighten these set screws. Before I do though, you may have noticed as I tightened the spring that it got a little bit longer. That's what springs do when you apply tension to them. And I want to make sure it hasn't bound up anywhere on this torsion tube and that it has stretched its full length, because if it's too tight, it will shorten the lifespan of the spring. So you can grab the bottom tensioning rod and pull it away from the door just about an inch or so, and while you're holding that, you can just hit the top here with your other tensioning rod, and that'll stretch the spring all the way as far as it needs to go. Okay, with all of that done, we're ready to tighten our set screws. As before, you take these set screws and tighten them with your hand until you feel it hit the torsion tube, and then it only needs about a 1/2 to 3/4 more of a turn to bite in all the way and hold this spring's tension. we'll go 3/4 of a turn. With that done, now you can put one of your tensioning rods back in and lift it up just a little bit to pull the tension off the lower rod. Pull the lower rod out and then slowly release the tension on your upper rod, making sure that the spring stays tensioned. Now that we're done applying tension to the spring, we're going to go ahead and hold down the door with one hand while we remove these vice grips to make sure the door's not going anywhere. Nope, we're good. Also, it's time to remove the vice grips that we were using up here at the top by the drums. Next, we can reattach our trolley arm. All right, our spring has been tensioned. I've removed the vice grips that were protecting anything from going wrong. I've checked to make sure that the cables on both sides are routed properly over their drums and through the channels where they belong behind each of the hinges. And now we're going to try and open the door by hand. And you want to put it up about 1/3 of the way or so, and it should stay right where you put it. So far, so good. It goes up very, very easily, but it stops right where you stop it. Then you want to put it up, about halfway, and see if it stays. Now, it's not quite staying at the halfway mark. So then we're going to want to go up to about the 3/4 mark, and it is staying there. So this one, I think I'm going to put one more turn into this spring because it really should stay right where you set it when you put it up to the halfway mark. So we'll put the vice grips back on the track to prevent the door from opening and on the torsion tube to prevent it from spinning. Then once again we'll use our winding bars to brace the spring so it can't unwind. Then we can loosen the set screws on the spring and add one more turn. Then we'll tighten the set screws back down, safely remove our winding bars, and finally remove the vice grips and repeat the opening test. All right, I added one more turn to the spring. Let's see how it performs now. Bring it up to about halfway and it stays exactly where it's supposed to. Up 3/4 or so. Again, it's staying exactly where I put it. Everywhere in the travel of the door, if I let go of it, it just stops. That's exactly what we're looking for to make sure the tension is set properly on the spring. And opened all the way, it looks great. Now that we've manually tested the door, we're ready to plug the opener back into power and to try using the opener. We're going to manually hit the button to see how well it opens. I'm specifically looking to make sure everything is traveling smoothly on the tracks, and I'm listening for anything binding up or getting stuck. Everything sounds great and looks great as well. Now we're going to check how well it closes. Now that everything's put back together and tested, the last thing I recommend is that you lubricate your garage door and all of its moving pieces. Now I have a prior video that goes over all the different parts that you need to lubricate when you're considering taking care of your garage door. In that video though, I recommend using a silicone or a lithium-based lubricant. Those work really well, but now I recommend this stuff instead. It is purpose formulated specifically for garage doors, and it does a great job. Links for all of that, as well as all the tools that I used in this video, can be found down in the description. If you've enjoyed this video or learned a little something, you can let me know that with a thumbs up down below. If there's something I did that was just boneheaded, wrong, or you think can be improved on, and trust me, I hear from a lot of you about that from time to time, let me know about that down in the comments section down below. If you want to see more content like this to improve your life, do things yourself, save some money, you can think about subscribing, but there's never any pressure from me to do that, of course. And as always, thank you very much for watching. A little bit of garage door lubricant will really help this job to run smoothly. See what I did there? Try and wipe all the schmutz off me. I don't know what else to say here. Using today as well. Shoot, the first take was better. Put me in, coach. I'm ready. Okay. One of those will work. What do you say we actually start?
All right.